Hi everyone. This doesn't really seem like the time for taglines that were made to throw hate back on the haters or anything else, so I'm just going to get right down to it. There's been a lot of talk about the coronavirus, COVID-19, back and forth. It's nothing, it's everything, and I'd actually put my stock more in the people who are saying worst case scenario than best case scenario on this situation. There's a lot of food prepping at the moment, but I don't think anyone's prepared for just how bad this could be. And so I wanted to talk about emotionally preparing for COVID-19 when everything hits the ceiling, when it all goes to hell in a handbasket and we have a nightmare situation on our hands. Late last year, the World Economic Forum, the Johns Hopkins Center for Health Security, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation held an exercise called Event 201. Now, Event 201 was a 3.5-hour pandemic exercise that had participants from several different stakeholders, several different organizations. For example, Lufthansa were involved when it came to travel, for example, and there were about 20 panelists from memory that were there participating in the exercise, working how things would look in terms of communications, travel, medical care, the works. And their scenario is worth noting because there are some similarities. Their theoretical scenario had a coronavirus that was brand new on the planet called CAPS, that was basically started out in Brazil. There was a failure to contain it. It spread throughout the world, and within 18 months, 80 to 90% of people had it. Now, their particular version, with its fatality rate, its complication rate, etc., theirs had 60 million deaths. The problem I see is that when you look at COVID-19, the Chinese Communist Party could have contained it. They didn't. They were too busy playing politics. Likewise, several groups have been softballing China because of economic reasons, because they don't want China to go under, because it would send the world economy into a tailspin. There was someone from a Biotech Futures article, in a Quillette article I was reading recently, that this guy from a biotech futures firm turned around and said that governments are worried about panic in terms of schools being shut down and Costco not having food on the shelves. But real panic is someone having their mother die in the hospital car park because the hospitals had to turn them away because they're over capacity. And unfortunately, because our leaders have had the wrong priorities with this, because we are talking about a virus that spreads for 2 to 3 weeks from someone before someone even knows they have it, because we have governments that are treating this like so many other massive diseases where they are contagious when they're symptomatic, or they don't have as long an asymptomatic period. We're finding that cases are just blowing up all around the world, and my money would be on COVID-19 infecting 80 to 90% of the population within 18 months of when it started, just like what Event 201 predicted. Now, we might get lucky. It may do what West African Ebola did, where West African Ebola mutated. It became a harmless, asymptomatic version that spread far and wide, and by the time the dangerous version hit the other, everyone had already contracted the harmless version, and that inoculated everyone. That's a possibility, but it's not a guarantee. Here's the reality. When 80 to 90% of people get this, you have 80 to 90% of people facing a 5% chance of being in critical care and a 14% chance of being in acute care. Now, those two cases need hospitalization. And in the case of critical care, if someone is not in a critical care bed on a respirator with an oxygen mask, they're going to die. It's that simple. Now, 4 to 4.5% of the entire population, which is 80 to 90% of 5% if you're on the maths, might not seem that big, but let's take Sydney, for example. Let's say Sydney has 8 million people. It's got close to that. Now, 4% of that, we'll just go with 4% on the low end, just to show this problem. 4% of the entirety of Sydney needing critical care beds is 320,000 people. That's 320,000 people needing to be in intensive care and closely monitored. Sydney would be lucky to have 20,000 hospital beds, period. So suddenly, you're in a situation where 300,000 people who will die if they don't get hospital care get turned away. That's to say nothing of the 14%, which is what, 1.2 million or something, or around a million, of people who are acute, who aren't going to get the care, and then run the risk of deteriorating into a critical case of viral pneumonia. Because that's the thing, these acute and critical cases are viral pneumonia. That's how bad it gets. So you've got that. You have a situation where potentially, just on the hospital system becoming overloaded, you could potentially, and that's all of us, that's me included, all of us could be saying goodbye to 1 in 5 people we know and love. It could be us that bites the dust from this. But that's only part of the problem. Cities are very centralized and dependent entities. Most cities have a 3 to 5 day food supply. They have about a 3 to 5 day chlorine supply. For the water supply, that's one thing people don't think about. The water in that your drinking water has chlorine put into it, and that chlorine, the stockpiles of it are limited. Then you've got other problems. Your garbage doesn't miraculously get rid of itself. You have garbage collectors for that. If you have power lines or phone lines going down, you rely on line workers to fix those. Sewage systems, you have sewage workers. People working on your power grid, for example. People trucking in those supplies. Firefighters to fight fires. Police to handle law and order. Then you've got things like the people who work on roads, work on buildings, work on critical infrastructure in terms of construction. And these are just some of the things you have to worry about. Now, do you know what happens when these people are sick in bed? Those systems break down. Your garbage doesn't get collected, it builds up. And bear in mind that what we know from Wuhan is, in many cases, people are sick in bed with what feels like the mother of all flus. This is the cases that don't wind up in hospital. They're sick in bed for 4 to 5 weeks with that. You know what your garbage situation looks like when your garbage collectors are overwhelmingly sick in bed for 4 to 5 weeks? It's piled up outside your house, where suddenly you're dealing with all kinds of disease, and suddenly you have disease vectors affecting things that you weren't even counting on. What happens when the power lines go down and the line workers are all sick? They don't get fixed. You're out of power. You have no phone. You have no landline, no internet for weeks on end. What happens when you run out of chlorine for the water supply? You need to purify your own water, or you could potentially get sick from drinking water. What happens when there's no food on the shelves because it's not being trucked in? The answer is you have what supplies you have, whatever you might have in the garden if you're lucky. You might be able to get help from a friend, although they're probably going to be skint themselves. Or you starve, literally. What happens when your house burns down and the fire department isn't there to put it out because they're all sick in bed? Bye-bye house. What happens when crime goes through the roof and you're facing a violent criminal and the police can't come in time because they're all sick in bed and those that are there are stretched thin? Bad things is the short answer. This is not going to end well at the rate it's going. I mean, the good news is that if the caps model holds up, and it's looking like it should with any luck, we've only got 18 months of this to worry about, and we're already through 3 of it. But bear in mind that this is not going to end well. And the other thing, don't trust the media on this. One thing people need to realize is that governments and media are looking at this from a couple of perspectives. One is they know damn well that if people were told that 80 to 90% of them were going to be sick, that 1 in 5 people they knew, or even them, were going to die, and there was nothing that could be done. Because let's face it, a vaccine is nowhere in sight. There are antiviral drugs that can be used to treat it, but they're in very limited quantities, and I highly doubt we can roll out 1 billion doses in over a year. But I digress. Governments and bureaucrats know that if they let the truth out on this, there would be social order collapse overnight. Society would go to hell in a handbasket. There'd be absolute anarchy. There'd be rioting. People would be acting like it's the end of the world and nothing they did mattered, and so they could bring out the worst in themselves. That's part of it, but the other part as well is they're worried about the economic impacts. They don't want a global depression. Unfortunately, a global depression is probably inevitable on this. You're going to find that systems are going to be shut down. China will probably, unfortunately, be okay with this. They don't deserve to be, considering they could have curtailed this, and they didn't. Unfortunately, China is probably going to sit pretty until and reveal the numbers when everyone else reveals theirs, at the point where people are going, well, it doesn't matter where I move my business to because everywhere's sick. So China probably will come out of this more unscathed than they deserve to be. But the governments of the world are concerned about an economic fallout, and so they downplay it. Then the media decides they'll sensationalize a little bit, but in this case the media still isn't telling people how bad it really is. The reality is that if you're watching this, you need to prepare for the worst. You need to be prepared for the fact that you're probably going to get this virus. We all are, realistically, in the overwhelming majority of cases. You need to be prepared for the fact that when it gets really bad, when the system gets overloaded, you are probably going to lose loved ones. You are probably going to lose 1 in 5 people you know and care about, or hate. But I would hope that when things get this bad, people might realize that hate's just not worth it. That we really should focus on what's here. Now, to be clear, this is not the end of the world. I think this has the potential in terms of death to get close to the Black Plague, don't get me wrong. I think 20% of the world's I think the Black Plague killed off 1/3 of the world's population. This will probably kill off 1/5, or in the vicinity thereof. But then there's the unknown of what happens when society breaks down, cities break down, and you get extra disease, you get extra deaths as a result of social infrastructure and urban infrastructure collapsing. In some places in the world, that could bump it up to 1/3 or even 1/2 of all people, possibly. Especially if, for example, you get a really bad dysentery break out in cities because they become so unhygienic in tightly packed cities, and suddenly there isn't the medication to go around because the system's stretched. This could quite literally be worse than the Black Plague, and in some ways, when the Black Plague hit, we were in a situation where we were in towns. We were in towns that were fairly self-sufficient. We weren't relying on centralized production like we do these days in our global economy. So there's no way around this. The reality is, each of us needs to grieve for what's to come. Accept the worst, accept that 1 in 5 people you know and love are probably going to die. If you have elderly parents, one or both of them are probably going to die. And that's not a fun thought. But if you're not prepared, if you are not emotionally prepared for what is going to come, the coronavirus won't be the only thing that you have to worry about ending you. The shock and the grief of the devastation around you might just finish the job. I often say to everyone, be kind to each other, you deserve it. Well, in this case, being kind to yourself and to each other is opening your eyes. Seeing what's to come, seeing that we'll get past this, we'll survive it, but it's going to be hell in the interim. And we need to be ready for that. We need to prepare for it as best we can, so we can be there for ourselves and for each other when the tough times come ahead. Because the reality is that as this gets worse and worse, we are going to need each other more than ever. And we are going to need each other's support more than ever in helping all of us pick up the pieces for each other. Until next time, folks, be kind to each other. You deserve it.